honourable leader of the third party.
Mr. Speaker, this NDP government is about to waste a golden opportunity to improve the lives of children in care. Opposition demanded an all-party committee so the minister could not hide until the next child death hits the headlines. Government instead chose a ministerial panel which does allow the toughest issues to be buried out of public view. Now our fears have foundation. Many of the panel's recommendations go into what the government calls, and I quote, no legislative change required. To the Premier, you told Albertans in this House the panel would make meaningful recommendations for real change and they would be listened to. Why did you not keep that promise?
The honourable Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I would suggest that the member opposite read the legislation a little bit more carefully, as well as the recommendations a little bit more carefully, because there is almost no recommendation that the government hasn't committed to moving forward on, and where the legislation reflects the recommendations. Indeed, the legislative drafting process began by looking at the recommendations, and I can take every recommendation and attach it to an action or a legislative change. So I'm not sure what the member opposite is actually talking about. I'm very pleased with the work that has moved forward on this so quickly after decades of being ignored through an all-party process. And quite frankly,
Thank you. I will table today a government document showing many of the recommendations, and beside it says no legislative change required. Premier, you're not telling us the facts. The legislation labels many of the panel's recommendations as not needing legislation. I don't agree, but since your minister's decided not to commit to legislation for these changes, she now has had 6 weeks to take internal action on these key changes to be made. The answer won't fit in 35 seconds, so please, Premier, can you tell this House and all of Alberta where we can find a written account of the specific non-legislated changes made, or have you done nothing?
Good question. The honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, it is super rich for the member opposite to suggest that a 6-week turnaround from a group of recommendations into this House as a form of legislation is doing nothing after the decades of inaction by those people over there. How outrageous. That being said, Mr. Speaker, what we did, and just so that the member opposite is clear, when it says no legislation required, it means we can follow the recommendation without changing the law. So that's what it means. It doesn't mean that we're not going to do it. We have every intention of doing it, and the member opposite should read the legislation and read the recommendations.
Second supplement.
I helped write the recommendations, Mr. Speaker, and the Premier hasn't acted on a single thing she had a chance to say. She notes that she can publish the name of a child. Paula Simons had to wake this Premier and all of us up. She said that the child Serenity's name can be named by the Journal, but not by the Advocate. As a result, we're at risk of ignoring the plight of children in care until there's public outrage. We have to do better if justice is to be achieved. Is that the best we can do? Premier, will you commit to additional legislation to include more of the panel's recommendations in the next session of the legislature? Because you haven't acted on the ones that aren't in legislation now.
The honourable Premier.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And again, I would suggest that the member opposite read the recommendations, because nowhere in the recommendations does it suggest that we start publishing the names of every child whose fatality is investigated by the Advocate. So that's not in the recommendations, and for him to imply that they are is exceptionally disingenuous, Mr. Speaker. That being said, we are moving forward on the recommendations. We've brought in legislation within 6 weeks. They have never acted that fast to get their parking space allocated, let alone to work on an important piece of legislation that matters to Albertans.